Welcome to today's live stream on the Boston bombing, or as our documentary put it, the Boston unbombing. As we've started to look at some of these events, I'm surprised in some ways that I haven't looked into this sooner. I'm also impressed by the number of people who put in a lot more study into it than I have. But as far as the Boston bombing in my universe, I knew that it happened, but I didn't know too much else about it. I really didn't look into it. And this documentary, it's fairly long, but about half an hour in, I realized that this thing had been a total scam. And it seems so obvious. But I think part of the challenge and part of why these sorts of things are able to be pulled off is people are not paying attention to the greater narrative, and they're convinced by whatever they're told. People want to believe what the authorities tell them. That's not an unreasonable desire in a rightly ordered universe. That makes sense. But when we have other interests in control, then there's everything to be suspicious of. So if you haven't had time to watch this, um, I would encourage you to at least watch an hour. He goes into pretty forensic detail down to freeze framing and then showing you the video and then pointing arrows. He draws arrows, he draws lines. And what he's contending and what I believe is that this was a disaster preparedness drill done with cooperating actors and EMTs and doctors who may everyone who was involved had their own reasons. Maybe they were in favor of gun control and this would help with that. Maybe they were interested in helping military families, or maybe as the news reported, there was going to be a drawdown, a sequestration of funds, and this was a preemptive move to keep those funds in position. So I think the person who did the video was willing to acknowledge that the people who were duped into doing this may have had noble reasons. And their idea was, well, no one will get hurt and we'll get funding for these important programs. And anyway, we need to practice disaster preparedness. But what's obvious is this didn't happen. The people who were shown the idea that my clothes were burned off, they show, I think his name's Steve Byrne. My clothes were burned off, but all the photographs of him show him having clothes on. And not just clothes on, but clothes with almost nothing. He had a white top on, so no blood. He's talking about getting hit in the neck, and that something still hasn't been removed. So all of the shrapnel is going to go out and hit a bunch of people, and they're talking about BBs and nails, etc. But where are the BBs? Where are the nails? Where's the blood? There's no blood on this guy who said that his clothes were burned off. Other people say their pants were blown off, and you can see that these giant rips and tears, but no blood. So if my pants are blown off by this blast, which ostensibly also had nails and BBs in it, I'm going to have some nails and BBs in my flesh, minimum. Nothing. You see basically just bare legs with some ripped off, and then you see other ones which look very much like they were cut by scissors. Another one where it just looks like a slit where someone had just cut it. That's just not how something would look. And the entire sequence with what the narrator calls Cowboy Carlos, who is an actor, he has acted in another film before, has an American flag in his hand, climbs over the fence. I mean, it's like did he pull out the American flag out of his pocket? Okay, I'm ready to go. I'm going to charge this fence. And then when he climbs over, he's taking photos. I wanted to document the situation. Famous dancing Israeli line. I wanted to document the event. Catholic priests were barred from. I've actually, interestingly enough, when I looked at the news article, Oblates of the Virgin Mary, I had visited them when I was exploring a vocation on Boylston Street. So I've I've actually been not far from where those priests were trying to get to the victims, and they were told they couldn't come. Why? Because there were scene blockers. There were people who were there who were making sure that cameras couldn't get in. You see people pointing to cameras. So Cowboy Carlos is there, American flag, jumps over the fence, takes some photos, and it shows there are three doctors and an EMT around the person. I think his name is Jeff. The double amputee who had put on these fake legs to then be bloodied. And then you see the photo with all of this flesh, fake flesh hanging out, almost getting caught in the wheelchair wheels. Why does Carlos need to rush this guy to a medical tent when he was surrounded by three doctors and an EMT? They could have treated him in place. And you wouldn't put him up and put him onto a wheelchair anyway, that you could just brought a stretcher. They're not far from the medical tent. This guy who apparently had his legs blown off has a lady right next to him who has nothing wrong with her. So how is it this guy gets his legs blown off, but the lady next to him is fine? There's the pink vest lady who is the wife of a real estate developer who's wandering around there. She's going around putting something on people's faces, and what you can do is you can activate this powder. He called it magic blood powder. Another liar said he was knocked off the couch on the third floor of his building by the blast, but you can see the blast doesn't even affect the flags that are flying nearby the first explosion. Really interesting. I obviously I should have known that in movies they have all sorts of gear to make wounds look like wounds, but on clothes that works for the movies. But when you have a photograph and you're able to look at it and you show it to doctors and say, well, that's clearly a fake wound. Why? Because it looks rubbery. It looks like silicone. Human flesh doesn't form that way after it's been torn. Uh, Marilyn Height, towards the end of the documentary, identifies a woman who had a white band-aid wrapped around, I think, her thigh, but she apparently had part of her thigh blown away, but she has a white bandage with no blood. Probably she was late. She was probably not in the position she was supposed to be in time. She wanders into the scene. They realize it's too late for us. So they push her away. They push her away from the scene. This is a woman who apparently has a giant hole in her thigh, walking, and with a white bandage with no blood, and they push her away from the scene. So a lot of these other things in which you see people directing traffic, pushing people away, making signals, and the fact that you have these delays between when someone is injured and when they're moved out, and there's no real blood anywhere. The wounds are not bleeding. Why? Because they pushed a squib to create an illusion of blood, an illusion of a wound, but a real wound would continue to bleed, and these were not real wounds. It's shocking, really, and it doesn't take a lot of time if you just look at 3 or 4 examples of so-called victims, which the documentarian does. And he says he could do, 5, 6 more. But the point is, if there's just 1 or 2 or 3, that should be enough. But for other people, they want to believe that, no one would ever lie to me. I live in a universe where my government always tells me the truth. The media never lies to me. There were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, remember? Let's see what the chat says. Raise a false flag. Yeah, I think pretty obviously, pretty odd. I agree. This reminds me that there was footage we noticed during that time after the bombing that was suddenly removed by the media. I wouldn't be that surprised. With someone being arrested in a neighborhood some miles away. I I don't think he really gets too much into the arrest of the patsy insofar as his focus is more on looking at the event. He really laser focused on that, and so we get a lot of time with photos and with video footage, etc. Yeah, it's funny, Antonio. I think the idea would be, what was Carlos's first idea, that um, I need to take a photo of this limbless guy. And I think obviously he was told to take some photos, but he has to understand it's not a realistic narrative. The first thing I'm doing when I'm going to go rescue somebody is I'm going to whip a camera out and take some photos. They have such contempt for the average person to put on such a sloppy face. Yeah, I agree. But the thing is, you don't have to have contempt. This is just the reality. People are not paying attention to what's going on. So it's very easy to pull off even something sloppy like this one. So not I really don't have too much to say here insofar as the the end the end another terrorist attack at home only fuels the narrative that we have to continue to fight. He points to the fact that Hillary Clinton was pushing for war in Syria, and if you go all the way to the end of the link that I sent, he actually goes on to talk about some other events which I think are helpful as well. Don't want to get distracted and go down those other rabbit holes, but I think it is important to note that he sees this as a continuum of other false flag events and that they're worth looking at. Something I alluded to, and I haven't even looked into it very deeply, but I knew enough to know that Assad did not gas his own people long ago. President Trump announces, "I'm leaving Syria." 3 days later, Assad gasses his own people. Oh, I guess we'll have to stay in Syria now. It just doesn't. It doesn't. These things are so obvious. I think most people actually sense the government deceives them, but like the Matrix movie, prefer the illusion to horrific reality and all its implication. Yes, I think I'm imagining who is it? Cipher, the character, the Joey Pantaleone character. He says, "I want to come back," and he's eating a steak. "I want to come back someone important, like an actor." Obviously, there's a bit of an in joke there because he is an actor. And he said, "I don't want to remember anything, nothing." Yeah, and of course he's trusting the machines to plug him back in, as if they couldn't just kill him. So cooperate with the machines, and everything will be fine. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. All right, everybody. If there's nothing else, just remember a plug for the stream coming up in about 15 minutes or so over at Palestine Bookshelf. We're going to be talking about the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Not a false flag, very interesting conflict for a number of reasons. I'm going to get into that. But continuing to build the bricks of knowledge, remember that if you're going to talk about the Palestine issue, you have to understand the history. It's not enough to watch what's going on now. Greatest attack on Palestinians since the Nakba, and 1967. But you have to understand, how did we get to this point? And last week we talked about the 67 war. 73, there's still more consequences echoing from 67, but more about what's going on around the Palestinians than the Palestinians themselves, interestingly enough. So if you want to join me about 15 minutes over at Palestine Bookshelf, we'll be talking about that. Naruto. I have not seen Naruto. I feel I should have. It sounds vaguely familiar, but if you can maybe put a link in the comments. There's a character named Madara who wishes to end suffering by forcing everyone into an illusion without suffering. Well, this is explored tangentially in the Watchmen graphic novel, and the idea that people cannot be trusted to know the truth, so we have to make things up in order to govern them sensibly. This is an important theme, and yeah, an interesting idea. Um, what do you do what do you do when you have no suffering? You're you are in this, let's say, contented state, but it's unrealistic in relation to humanity, is that we cannot sustain contentedness because there is a hunger in us for something beyond the natural world. There's a hunger in us for God, cannot be satisfied. So even a period of contentedness, what Madara is proposing, can only work for a certain amount of time for humans. We can't sustain that. And that's something I have told students when I've been a teacher over many years is happiness is a byproduct. It's not an end. And happiness comes and goes. Contentedness comes and goes. What is important is that you are focused on your purpose, not just the broader purpose of all humans, which as I've said before in different videos, has been to know, love, and serve God. to be happy with him forever in heaven. That is the purpose that is assigned to all of humanity. But our individual purpose, what are we individually fitted for? And as long as we're staying on that purpose, there will be moments of happiness and contentedness that will come to us, but they are not something that we should seek for themselves. And even when we do experience them, they're not something that stays forever. They are ephemeral, and we should appreciate them, but be indifferent and detached from them as a goal. That shouldn't be our goal. It should just be a byproduct of our purpose. Am I Catholic? Yeah. Yes, I am. There should be some fairly obvious paraphernalia to indicate that, but I suppose I can point some of them out. This is the Crucifixion by Velasquez. I got that print in the Prado in Madrid. There is a I have to get my pointing correct. So that is a image of Christ crowned on over on there. That's Saint Pius X. That's a photograph of Saint Pius X, and then that is a famous um, dual heart of the Sacred Heart and the Immaculate Heart, and it's very well known in the Vendée region. The Dilbert figure gave it away. Yeah, I know. Obviously, the Dilbert. But interestingly, Scott Adams, he's got some loony ideas, but there's a lot that Scott Adams says that makes a lot of sense. So, was there a Chinese balloon in the marathon? Don't know. That wasn't mentioned in this documentary. I was raised Catholic too, I could tell. Hopefully, you stayed Catholic, but that's probably a conversation for another time and something probably more personal than to be shared on a YouTube stream. All right, everybody, thank you for taking the time to stop by. As I say, if you have not had the chance to watch this, you don't have to commit to all 3 hours. I think if you just watch within 30 minutes, I was sending screenshots to a couple of friends saying this thing is a total fraud. So I think even if you watch an hour of it, you'll see what was going on that led to this. And that way you don't have to commit to all 3 hours. So as I say, just watch 30 minutes, watch an hour. And if you want, keep watching. I think you'll find it useful. But this is yet another one of these false flags to help you understand that these things happen fairly regularly. They're not once in a lifetime thing. But all right. As I said, shameless plug, Palestine Bookshelf. It'll be about 12 minutes from now. We're going to discuss the 1973 war over there, the Al Jazeera documentary that explained lots of the events and the aftermath of that. Thanks for stopping by. Hope to see you over on that channel in a little while.